Portcullis House.
What's a bit wrong shit in the other one?
Morning. Sorry you've had to wait a few minutes. It was our first day back and our private business seemed to have overrun slightly, but we're very glad to see you again. I think this is pretty well-trodden territory. You won't be surprised by the issues we're going to raise. I'd like to start. When the fourth carbon budget was set, expectations about the economy, I think, were a bit more optimistic than actually materialised. So the recession has been more protracted and deeper than most people thought 3 or 4 years ago. Would it not therefore be logical that if there was to be any change in the fourth carbon budget, it should be to tighten it rather than to loosen it?
Well, I think the first thing, Mr. Chairman, was that we do say in our report that the circumstances are such that if any change were to be contemplated, tightening would be the most likely alternative to remaining as it is. I mean, that we made absolutely clear. Our own view is that the effect of the recession and other things, put that together, is that the case for tightening is not sufficiently strong at this moment to overcome the better case for continuity and giving people a continuing understanding of where we're going. And there are some things in the future which might make that tightening more necessary, not least if the British government's pressure in the European Union were to be wholly successful. If what Britain is seeking to get in terms of the European Union decisions were to come about, then we would have to look again at the way in which we were going to meet that. But it doesn't seem to us to be sensible to try to prognosticate on that, and that where we are brings us at the lower level of what the European Union might be considering, and that seems to us to be the safest place to be now. But you're perfectly right. There are a number of pressures, not just that, which would lead one to think that perhaps tightening would be the better form. But I think the balance is that continuity, consistency, and giving people confidence that we go on as we promised is more important.
And just on cost-effective measures and investments, so there were a cost-effective set of measures that we identified when we advised on the fourth budget originally. That is largely unchanged since 2010 when we gave the advice. If you combine that with, as you say, the lower demand projections that are due to the recession, then the cost-effective part entails lower emissions than it previously did.
Right. Do you think that the very process of review and the discussion about whether the budget should be tighter or looser, is that going to affect, perhaps already affecting, investor confidence? And a lot of the investment decisions about in industries where they are significant emitters are very long-term decisions. And do you have any concern that if we had this debate, we're clearly going to have this debate about the budget review, is that going to affect investor confidence?
Well, the first thing is it's obviously depends upon the protraction of this consideration of the advice which we have given. It seems to me there is a proper balance between ensuring that we see that the budget, given that it has by its nature to be a long-term one, seeing that the budget continues to be based upon the sensible criteria which we have laid down and which the government has accepted. So I'm not I'm not unhappy about the process of review, and of course it is actually written into the Climate Change Act, so it must be admissible. I think the question really is, given the security and strength of the advice which we have been able to give, if the government is also able to accept our advice that it should be agreed rapidly, I don't think too much harm will have been done, and you have to weigh that off against, on the other side, the public recognition that we do look at these things extremely carefully, and we've been through it in the very most detailed way. And I think that's helpful too, because those who are unhappy about the whole system will of course find reasons for disagreeing with it, but at least they can't say that we haven't looked at it extremely carefully, and I think that's an important part. So I think there are both sides to that.
As part of the review, we did consult with a wide range of industry players, and there was a very strong message. It wasn't unanimous, it was from nearly all of the players, that an early decision to keep the budget at the same level would help to improve their confidence. I think when we gave the advice, the CBI has come out and publicly said they think it's probably sensible now to keep the budget at the same level.
How quickly would you hope this review process is going to be concluded?
Well, like you, Mr. Chairman, having been a minister, I'm always unhappy to press people to do things more quickly than the sort of bureaucratic system works. But I would hope that it will be as soon as possible, and I think that must be to the benefit of the government and to the benefit of industry, and indeed to the whole process of combating climate change.
So we're about 3 months away from Easter. Would this be a realistic target?
I'm not going to be pressed to deliver the government a date which I didn't do in the original document, but obviously the quicker it is done, and if that can be done before Easter, that would be particularly good.
Okay. John?
Yeah. To what extent do you think the potential negative social and economic impacts of meeting the fourth carbon budget can be managed?
Well, Mr. Robertson, I take this particularly carefully, and we do have a responsibility under the Act to consider fuel poverty as well as affordability. So obviously that's part of the whole discussion, and you will see from the document that we have considered that very carefully. We have pointed out that the government will need to have some additional measures, particularly to deal with the fuel poor who are dependent only on electricity. When we come to discuss these matters, we tend and have to take the average, which is, I think, if I'm remembering it now rightly, about 80% of households who are dual fuel households. The people who are particularly affected, as you yourself know from your constituencies, that are those that depend entirely upon electricity and who have particularly badly insulated homes. And around that area, there is a very specific need for proper government action. Now, some of that thing has happened, some of it we think needs to be looked at again. And then there is the whole question as to whether the burden of other parts of this should be borne on bills or on general taxation, but that is a matter for the government.
And it's just important to differentiate as well. I mean, there is a set of impacts for affordability and potentially for competitiveness that are related to the government's current policies out to 2020. The government's reviewed those recently, and it's decided that they are manageable. The incremental impacts associated with the fourth carbon budget are very small, both for affordability and for competitiveness. So,
yeah, and you said that, and basically what you're saying is, if I'm right, that fuel poverty really has nothing to do with climate change. Is that what you're saying?
Well,
I mean, that's how I read your report, and that surprises me when there's millions of people in fuel poverty in this country. And there'll be a lot more by the end of this year.
Well, I'm sorry, Mr. Robertson, if that is how the report can be read, because it's far from what...
Well, it says, I'll quote, for example, the incremental affordability and fuel poverty impacts are small.
Well, that is the distinction between the impact upon fuel poverty of the additional costs of implementing our climate change policy and the impact of increasing prices which come from the electricity companies themselves. So in the one case we're talking about £500, and in the other case we have been talking about less than £100. So you're talking about the distinction between those two. Now what we've said about the impact on fuel poverty of that part of the cost, which comes from the battle against climate change, what we said about that is that the government does need to have additional policies to deal with that specific element, as well as the increases which have been much bigger from the electricity companies themselves. So it's not a question of ignoring the impact upon the fuel poor. We have specifically taken into account, and we have specifically pointed to the issues, and we have specifically said that there is not sufficient coverage up to now.
So are you saying then that the government really has to protect the energy sensitive industries?
We're saying that too, and we have done a full research, Mr. Robinson, which I'm sure you've seen, in which we've looked at the money available for those industries, and we have concluded that the government's promise for compensation, if that's the right word, for the extra costs for energy-intensive industries is certainly sufficient to cover those extra costs. The problem is that the government has not yet been able to pay that money because at the moment it is still under the in the European Union being looked at as a state aid. It seems to us, frankly, that it clearly isn't a state aid, it's a perfectly proper thing to do, but while that's happening, these industries are not receiving the money, and that is a serious matter, and it's a matter which we very much regret.
We also say that the package that's been offered by the government at the moment, that is being considered in Brussels, only goes out to 2016-17, and it should be extended beyond that, given that electricity-intensive companies are making investment decisions that go 10, 20 and 30 years into the future.
And that has a specific importance in Scotland, for example, where there are a number of examples where major investments by major companies would be dependent upon getting that right.
Yeah, it strikes me as if in a lot of cases where the savings and emissions and the investments that have been made are all made, shall we say, in the sort of middle to top range of the money chain. And that is the poor are always the ones that are forgotten at the end of the day because there is no financial incentive to do anything there.
Well, the truth is that one of the problems that we have is that the cost of the energy efficiency measures for the consumer, which are aimed at the poorest in particular, is a real cost, and it's a cost that comes onto the bills. So there are both sides of that. On the one hand, if you raise the money to do the work, then who pays for that? And of course, some of that is being paid by the poorest consumers, and that's why we pointed to the need for special additional measures as far as the very poor are concerned. The other thing, Mr. Robertson, if I may say so, is that we have been looking at and will do in greater detail in our deep dive report, which will be published in July. Under the Climate Change Act, we are bound to do that, which is the four-yearly report. We'll be looking at the cost effectiveness of some of the measures, and for example, I've already trailed the fact that there are some real questions about whether the use of money to deal with insulation of solid walls is the most sensible way to use that money. So there will be things of that.
A big problem in my area, and the problem of course always is then if it's not financially worthwhile and you're not going to get anything out of it, then nothing gets done.
That is absolutely
true. Again, the ones down the bottom end of the money food chain have a real problem. Could I finish by just asking what are the potential wider benefits of maintaining the fourth carbon budget at its current level? Well,
the first thing is just to remind that the cost of the fourth carbon budget is relatively small. We're talking about something in the area of £20 extra onto the bills. That's roughly speaking what it is. The discussions that we've been having are about costs which are predate the fourth carbon budget. The second thing is that the wider benefits are, first of all, that industry and the consumer and the government knows exactly where it is. There is continuity for investment, which is what we want. Secondly, it makes sure that we are on track to meet our obligations, both our statutory obligations to reduce our emissions by 80% by 2050, our obligations under the European Union's present agreements, and indeed those that we are seeking to extend, our obligations under the United Nations agreements. We are on track for that, and we are on track for it in the most cost-effective manner. And that, of course, is a big issue, and that's one of the things we have to try to do, because however difficult the issues may be about fuel poverty and the like, the one thing we do want to have, if we're going to solve those, is to make sure that we're doing this in the most cost-effective way. So one of the things we did, Mr. Robertson, was to look at what would happen if you didn't do it in this way, but you backfilled, so to speak. You did it much later, and the results of our work there suggest that under almost any conceivable scenario, it would be very much more expensive. So I think those are all benefits which come from keeping to the present trajectory.
While I accept what you're saying, there's still the problem of the moral obligation. Do you look at the moral side of not doing anything for the fuel poverty area?
Well, I don't know how I can be more clear to you that fuel poverty is a central issue for the Climate Change Committee, but it's personally a central issue too, because although I used to represent for many years a constituency which was seen as a relatively comfortable constituency, like so many rural areas, I had some very poor people and areas. Some of the wards in Felixstowe, for example, are some poorest areas. And all I can say to you is that I won't forget and cannot forget the fact that what we have to do is to protect the poorest in the world and in Britain by getting our climate change policy right, but we must do that not at the present expense of the poorest. And we have to have a policy which enables us to pay for this without charging the poor beyond what they can reasonably expect to afford. And of course there are many who can't afford anything.
And are you telling the government this?
That is clear in our report.
Well, they're obviously not listening.
That would be entirely improper for me to comment on.
Yes, you mentioned the solid walls, and in
Yes.
rural areas, of course, the fuel poor are often in houses with solid walls. And so unless we do tackle the solid walls, we're not going to tackle the...
Well, Sir Robert, I think what I'm going to try to do is to present the government with the opportunity to see, because it's a governmental decision this, the costs that are involved in achieving a particular reduction in emissions by various routes. Now, if the government decides that because of the particular case which you mentioned, and it's a very real one, because of that, it wanted to go down a more expensive route, then that is a proper decision for the government. But it's a decision it must make. My job is to say, what is the effect of these various things in terms of my and the committee's responsibility, which is emission reduction.
I mean, it's not black and white either, in the sense that it's not black and white. Solid walls will be cost effective in some applications, and they will be relatively expensive in others. And what we'll set out is where is it sensible to do solid walls and where is it more questionable.
Of course, from your perspective of emission reductions, doing it in a wealthy person's household is probably going to reduce emissions more than in a fuel-poor household, because a fuel-poor household is limited in their energy use by their poverty. And when you put in insulation measures, what you're doing is actually making their quality of life better and not necessarily reducing emissions.
Well, Sir Robert, what you're identifying there is the fact that the issues we're dealing with have a multitude of facets, and you can't divorce these. Now, we have a responsibility to take full account of fuel poverty. So that is not the simple choice that we would make. But what we have to do is to point to the government. We are, in this area, absolutely the advisors of the government. Point to the government, what is the result of particular decisions? So first of all, what do you have to do in total to reduce the emissions? And then to say to them, if you do these things will arise. If you do those things, other things will arise. It is then for the government to make that judgment. Now, I can have a personal view. One of the things I do try to do, and it's quite hard to do it sometimes, is to stop what I would call mission creep. I mean, it isn't part of the Climate Change Committee's remit to tell the government that it should make that social decision as against that social decision. It is part of its mission to explain what happens if you do certain things and what happens if you do other things. Now, there is a particular, let's share a real issue. There is a particular problem with solid wall insulation, which we are considering very carefully, because there has been, it is alleged that the original calculations as to what the effect of energy reduction of solid wall insulation, that those original calculations made independently outside were in fact wrong. So the government must be aware. We must make clear that the government must know what the facts are. Then it must make the decisions.
And one other thing, you mentioned that Scotland was particularly relevant to the intensive industries decisions. Have you got some projects in mind?
Well, as I understand it, there are 6 cat crackers which, in Europe as a whole, which, I think it's 6, which deal with gas, and 2 of them in the United Kingdom, and 1 of those is in Scotland. There's an area where investment might well be very important. I take that as one example. And as you know, we've taken special care about Scotland, because Scotland does have targets and such like which are particularly tough, which it seeks to lead the rest of the United Kingdom, so we're watching it rather carefully.
I better remind the committee of my interest and the registered members' interest in light of that to do with the oil and gas industry.
And I'd better remind the members of the committee of my interest in the energy industry as well. Alan.
Just before I move on to what I particularly wanted to ask, as far as solid wall insulation is concerned, I think in your December report you suggested that a component target of fourth carbon budget would be something like 3.5 million solid wall insulations achieved by 2030, which clearly is a big chunk of the sort of various components of achieving that budget would be taken up by that target. Last year there were 16,000 solid wall insulations achieved in the UK, which means that the target will be reached, in 212 years' time. Is that a matter of rather fundamentally blowing apart the statistical makeup of what the budget might look like in terms of its components, or is that, as you say, something which is a palette of different options that may be pursued?
Well, it is a palette of the options, and up to now there have been decisions made by the by DEC as to how the money should be spent and what are the proper areas for it to be. And again, I come back to it. Overall, we see that the budget can, with reasonable comfort, be met. How you meet it is obviously flexible, and it is important for us to point to the government that it can meet it in some ways, which have socially valuable additions, in which case it will cost them more, or it can meet it in other ways without those socially valuable additions, which will still deliver the budget. Now, I still come back to the creep issue. I don't want to get into areas which the Climate Change Committee should not. Although you will know from my own views on these matters, it's very difficult to keep out of them, because I do have a very strong view that there is an important social issue here, that just as the poorest suffer most from climate change, and the poorest countries are least able to handle climate change, which is why one of the reasons we have a particular moral responsibility here. So it's true in our community, the poorest are going to suffer most from climate change because they don't have the ability. But at the present time, the poor suffer for all sorts of things, and we ought to have a policy which manifestly has, in the words of David Shepherd, a bias to the poor.
We asked a specific question. Given where we are with a low level of solid wall insulation at the moment, could you over a 15-year period grow that industry? And the answer is it is feasible. Yes, you could do that. You could get to several million insulations by 2030. Would you want to do that? Is it desirable? We've said, well, that's an open question, and we'll come back on that one in the summer. But there is the flexibility, as John says, within the budget to meet it in different ways with lower or higher levels of solid wall insulation or other measures such as heat pumps and whatever.
Could I just make some level of solid wall insulation, one might think.
Yeah, you would want some level. The question is, quite how ambitious should we be?
I was only going to say that the issue for us, yet again, is the government must have the best advice we can give so that it's quite transparent, the decisions that are made. And that must be, as far as possible, untrammelled by our own personal individual views about what those answers should be. That seems to me to be the decision I have to make, which is quite hard, I admit it.
So could you then take us through the general approach you then took to reviewing the fourth carbon budget? You essentially touched on this, but were the factors that you considered in reviewing the budget solely guided by, as it were, the words in the Climate Change Act, or were there a number of other factors that you looked at as well?
Well, we are bound by the Act, and the Act is very clear as to what we should do, and that is to take the factors upon which the original budget was based and then assess whether those factors have changed sufficiently to demand a tightening or loosening of the budget. And that is precisely what we did, and we didn't do anything else, because that is our statutory duty. And were we to confuse it in any other way, it seems to me that that would be not the way that you behave. So we have put it very clearly what the Act says you should do. Now, that very much helps the point that the Chairman made about does this process undermine investment confidence? And I think it might undermine it if I introduced all sorts of factors that were not part of that and not part of the Act. So trying to keep it to that is, I think, necessary.
I mean, there are 10 criteria in the Act upon which we gave our original advice, and just to collapse those into something that is generally intelligible, we advise on a budget which is the cost-effective path to meeting the 2050 target, subject to the impacts of being on that path being manageable. And so the question for the review is, well, has anything changed? Has there been a significant change that either the cost-effective path is different, or the impacts associated with being on that path, affordability, competitiveness, and the other factors, has anything happened to make those now prohibitive in a way that they weren't previously? And our conclusion is, well, no, the cost-effective path is broadly the same, and the impacts are broadly the same.
Right, but are there other factors that perhaps you didn't consider in terms of the 10 criteria in the Climate Change Act that could be seen to possibly be influencers of your review, particularly in terms of what factors had objectively changed over the period?
Well, not... there are no factors of which we are aware which would lead one to complain about the requirements of the Climate Change Act. In other words, there's nothing that we would want to say in brackets, oh, but by the way, although the Climate Change Act doesn't allow us to do this, we think we ought to take this into account. There's nothing of that sort, which I think is the only way I can put how one would look at it.
So that appears to loop back to the Climate Change Act itself and suggests that should that position be reached in terms of analysis, then there is no legal justification for changing the fourth carbon budget.
Well, that is our view. And having been through the Climate Change Act and discussions and the rest of it, I mean, that is the intention of the Climate Change Act, after all, is to have as secure and sure a trajectory as is possible in this confusing world. That's what the purpose was, and that's why it's laid down in this way. And we have to say that, and this is our duty, we have to say the only reason for change would be, in certain circumstances, not now able to be certain about, when there might be a requirement to tighten it. That's the only thing that we could say, and we've said that very clearly, and we've said that our duty will be to monitor that, and if we were to come to such a point, we would have to give that advice. But it's certainly not something that we would believe to be true now, nor in the immediate future.
I mean, there's an exhaustive process we've gone through in terms of our analysis, but also in wide consultation, nobody's suggested to us any specific significant change that has been upon which you could change the budget. So it's not just our view, nobody has brought this forward to us either.
Well, I mean, in the light of that, were you rather dismayed to hear just a little while ago that a minister in the Department of Energy and Climate Change firstly didn't appear to have read your extensive letter heralding the conclusions of the two reports that you sent to the department in October, or the two reports themselves that you sent to the department in November and December, and concluded that the report is just advice?
Well, you know, I've been around a long time.
Not that you've read it, but it was advice.
I've been around a long time, and one thing I'm very careful about is not entirely crediting every report of what ministers say. I didn't hear it said, and I really think that it's better not to comment on that. I know what we have proposed. I know what our legal position is, what the legal advice is, and we have kept to that. And it will be for the government to do the same.
Yeah, I mean, I think the essential point is the point at which, in the light of what the Act itself says and how your report has couched what the Act said in terms of its own conclusions, the point at which advice becomes rather more than advice in the light of what the Act itself says, and whether you're happy to have your reports and correspondence described in that way.
Well, I don't know whether it was described in that way, because I have no personal knowledge of what the minister said. I'm clear as to what the Act says. I have been very careful to understand what the Act says, as you would expect. You should not be the chairman of a committee which depends upon an Act without understanding what it says. Those areas which I was unsure, I've asked for proper advice, so I know precisely where legally we are, and that is made clear in our report and both in the report itself and in the introduction. So I have no doubt as to where we are. No doubt people will have their own views and the rest of it, but the fact of the matter is I think what we say there is exactly consonant both with the Act and with the legal position that has appeared.
Graham.
How did you go about reviewing the latest climate science, and how did that influence the recommendations on the level of the fourth carbon budget?
Well, obviously we had the advantage, certainly latterly, because we've been doing this research over a period, of the latest report from the IPCC, and we note that that report is consonant with every report that it has had since the beginning of those reports. We have a committee of experts who have raised the issues, and we have gone through those. We have a team which supports them, and we have had discussions with experts and organisations outside to come to these conclusions.
I mean, the one other thing we did, which goes beyond the IPCC report, we said, well, there's been a lot of debate in the last year or two about this thing, climate sensitivity. There is a high degree of uncertainty over what climate sensitivity is. And we said, well, rather than assume the most benign number for climate sensitivity or the most concerning, let's look across the range of that sensitivity. And so we did a lot of modelling of global emissions pathways across the range of uncertainty for climate sensitivity, and we concluded, given those uncertainties, given the risks, then the previous assumptions we made are still appropriate at the moment.
What I should say, Mr. Stringer, is this. I think the duty that we have, and particularly my duty as being the person on the committee who is not either an economist or a climatologist, I think my duty is to be almost cynically sceptical about whatever comes in front of me. So it's one of the reasons why I don't like the phrase climate skeptics, as if it means that the only people who are sceptical are those who take a view opposite to the IPCC. I think my job is to be very sceptical, and were you to sit in on the committee meetings, you'd find me asking the questions which certainly one or two members of this committee would ask, and certainly a lot of people outside. So I have really tried very hard to make sure that nothing is taken for granted, because that's the duty of the committee, because one of our requirements is to advise on the science.
Yeah. So would it be fair to say that what you're doing is a review of the latest literature with prominent and respected scientific advisors? That is how you're assessing it.
I didn't hear the word prominent after prominent. Prominent and...
I can't remember what I said now, but
Respected.
And
respected.
Yes, certainly that, but also at the same time, I and other members of the committee keep a very close eye on what those who take a different view think. I couldn't miss that, because they remind me of it on my Twitter account, even if I didn't pick it up elsewhere. So, I mean, one's always asking those questions, and I think that Dr. Kennedy would accept that he very often gets a note in the morning saying, so-and-so said this, now how does that fit in with what we said there? So one has a constant discussion about it. So nobody who has a different view should be unaware that every one of them is looked at very carefully.
But again, with climate sensitivity, we've looked at the full range of views, from the most benign to the most concerning, and across that range you come to the same conclusion, that early action at the global level is needed to achieve our climate objectives.
That was strange. I think I'm pleased that was right, because that's a very good example. There are people who are unhappy about the measures that we're taking, and who take the benign end, if you see what I mean, the one that is least. And what we said to ourselves, well, let's remember, although that's not the view of the majority, let's assume for a moment that they are right. What would that mean in terms of how you would recommend action? And we came to the conclusion that even if you take the most benign interpretation of the evidence, then you would still want to stick to the fourth carbon budget. Of course, if you take the other end of the scale, you might want to move very much faster, but you have to do what is reasonable, and so that's what we've done.
I share your attitude to scepticism. One shouldn't argue with the facts, but be sceptical about what is put in front of you. Your conclusion is that the latest evidence generally gives more confidence in the reality of climate change, in its causes and in projections for the future. Why do you have more confidence when the models have failed to predict the global surface temperature? Wouldn't that lead you normally to have less confidence?
Well, first of all, that refers to the overall pattern and picture. In so many areas, the predictions have turned out to be correct. The evidence has continued. And so overall, and that is an overall statement, not a specific one to that, that we've also looked particularly at that issue. And David, I would like to express what we came to the conclusion on that issue itself.
Yeah, I mean, the more confidence repeats the IPCC statement, which is about attribution of temperature change that we've seen in the 20th century. So,
well, I'm saying that's very strange as well, when it's the computer programs, the computer modelling has not managed to predict the temperature, either in the past or the future.
Yeah, so what we say on that, it is true that there has been a period of slower temperature increase, if not no temperature increase. It's been slower temperature increase. That is to be expected within a pattern of longer-term temperature increase and climate change. That's what we've seen historically. It's what the models suggest. The models are not designed to be able to predict the temperatures over 5, 10, 15 and 20-year timescales. They are designed to give us a projection of what is likely to happen over much longer timescales of 50 and 100 years. So the fact that temperature has only gone up very in small terms over the last 10, 15 years doesn't change the longer term predictions coming out of the model. I mean, there's nothing that makes us think differently about the greenhouse effect, for example. First of all, there's nothing that makes us think differently.
That's established physics. I mean,
absolutely, and there's nothing that makes us think we're not putting large amounts of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, which are well outside the million-year cycle now. So you would expect to see some significant warming in the future if we don't do anything.
Would you accept that there is no scientific process known at the moment that can separate background variation from that heat warming caused by the greenhouse effect and carbon dioxide? And the only way we have of doing that are the computer models, which aren't getting it right.
Well, you can work through and you can say, what are the different possible causes of the temperature increase we've seen over the last century? And you can say, well, is it solar radiation, for example? And you can rule that out. I mean, that's reasonably well established within the physics. Again, the conclusion of the IPCC, looking at all of the evidence, is that the only reasonable explanation of what we've seen over the last 100 years or so is that it's human-induced temperature increase. Now, there are alternative theories, and for example, the recent one that people talk about is this stadium wave theory that suggests there's a lot more natural variation we've seen over the last 50 years than other people have thought. And we have to consider that, we have to take it into account, but it's not the consensus view at the moment.
What do you mean by consensus?
I'm sorry, I just wanted to make a point about how one has to proceed in this world. It is always possible, with any argument, to suggest that there might be another explanation of which we haven't thought. That you have to say, well, if there is one, we have to look at it. Then it's possible to say, well, we've got this explanation, which we think is a better one than the one that you're using. That you do have to consider, and you have to consider it very carefully. And all I can say, Mr. Stringer, is that we have come to the conclusion, using the best evidence that we have, that no other explanation begins to be anything like as, I was going to say likely, but I think it's nearer to certain. In that sense, anything likely to be as certain as the concept that human intervention of the kind we've been talking about is causing and will continue to cause this effect on the climate. Now, that doesn't mean to say that were there to be other proposals, other ideas, things that we don't know about, we wouldn't be looking there. But human beings have got to proceed on the best evidence that they have. There is no other way of doing it. Because if we don't proceed on the best evidence we have, we're going to proceed on less good evidence, maybe the worst evidence that we have. So all the time, I just want you to be absolutely sure, because I know your position, it's one I respect, and we have had discussions on other committees in that way, and I think you'd agree that we more or less come to much the same methodological approach. I just want you to know that at no time do we fail to look at any suggestion, and that's really because I wish climate change wasn't happening. because I do think that it is a very significant challenge to us, and therefore, frankly, if I could find an easier answer, I would want it. So I'm emotionally concerned to do what you want me to do.
Can I just get back to what Dr. Kennedy was saying about the consensus? This is an extraordinarily complicated area of science. A lot of people involved aren't scientists. A lot of people, the vast majority of people aren't climate scientists. So the crutch that people go back on then is there is a consensus. Do you accept the criticism there has been of the major paper that gives the 97% consensus of Doran, Andreg and Cook, that actually somebody like me, who is probably more sceptical than you are about this issue, would be included as a supporter of the consensus, whereas I'm not really. And many major scientists have complained that in the review of their papers they've been included in that consensus, and there are other papers that say that actually within climate science itself it's about 50-50. I can give you the papers if you want, Bray and Hans von Storch.
There are I've read those and the work that has been done.
Yeah.
I don't think that I myself take the consensus word as referring to the 97% that particular paper. What I take it from is the undoubted fact that overall those who are concerned in this field have clearly come to a view which is that the climate is changing significantly, and that change is the effect of human activity, at least the effect of human activity is a major part of that. I'm not doing it on the basis of adding up and saying that one or that, and that doesn't seem to me to be the right way to do it. I think you have to look at the point. Now, even if you take the 50-50 argument, of course what you have to look is what are the bits of those papers which are applicable in these circumstances? And I think, actually, that gets you much closer to the original paper than the 50-50 argument. But, again, the big issue is to say, what is the most likely explanation, and what do the people who are most involved in this and who have looked at this most closely, what do they think? And what, indeed, in your mind, do you think of the evidence? You have to come to that, and I certainly believe that to say that the consensus, the scientific consensus, is clearly in this area is true. Just as to say that every, as I understand it, every applicable learned society would take that view. So I think that in the circumstances, this is the view that one should probably take, without ever resigning from the fact that there could be new evidence. Because if you're a scientist, or if you're trying to deal with science, you always have to say, what you're saying is the evidence that you've got at the moment. And if tomorrow something else happens, then you have to revise. It isn't a theology, it isn't religion, it isn't saying that's what's been said and therefore it will always be true. It is in fact science, and therefore all I can say is that from all that I read, all that I work at, the consensus is very clear. But tomorrow, someone may produce something which would suggest that we should think about it again. And if we do, we'll think about it very quickly.
Pino.
Dr. Kennedy mentioned that it's possible to explain, as indeed it is, possible to explain the pause in any statistically significant warming over the last 15 years by natural variations. If natural variations are that substantial for that period, could they not have been that substantial for a similar period in the opposite direction over the previous 20 years? Could they not have made a significant contribution to measured warming during the period of warming between 1975 and 1997?
You can answer, but I will answer too if you like.
Yeah, you can't rule that out. It is possible. So natural variation is uncertain. So I talked about this thing that a lot of people now are talking about, the stadium wave theory, which says we've underestimated the impact of natural variation in the historical record and overestimated the impact of human influences. So you can't rule that out. But would you base policy on everything we've seen is natural variation and we shouldn't worry about the future, putting a load of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, and we would not expect to see significant temperature increase? No, that is not the basis for policy at the moment.
But you'd expect over the long term natural variations to cancel out?
No, one wouldn't. I don't think that's the way we should even think about natural variation. You would expect over the long term for natural variations to have different effects at different times, and you would actually take that into account. Yes, that's perfectly true. But I think there's something, the sort of mechanistic concept that you have a lot of natural variations here that have one effect, and then that's countered by a lot of natural variations here who have a different effect. I don't think that's the way you have to look at it. You have to look at it. You're trying all the time to see what natural variations at any particular time have, what effect they have. And also the effect of man-made changes which come from emissions. And you've had to do that on a sensible basis. So I wouldn't do that absolute about it, no.
If you take the particular paper, the stadium wave theory, it's important to note that the principal author of that paper says, well, while this is important looking back over the last decades, it has no implications for our understanding of long-term temperature increase. That was the principal author of that paper. No implications at all.
Well, I wasn't referring to that paper, but I imagine he values his grants, so he would make that sort of statement almost.
Can I just say, Mr. Chairman, I was going to say it very directly.
Sorry, may I finish my point?
Well,
may I finish my point, then you can respond
you
to it. Almost every paper I read, even when it contains substance which raises doubts as to the strength of global warming, ends up by saying, but it's terribly important, we must not reduce our efforts. That seems to be a mantra which is required of people in this profession. Not surprising, given the state employs 3,600 people on climate science.
I want to say something very clearly, and it's this. I don't think I have ever accused those who disagree on climate change with unworthy motives. People working in the climate change area do so because they are scientists, because they want to find the truth. I find it increasingly unacceptable for people to undermine their position by saying they're only doing it for the grant, or they say this to protect themselves for the grant. I don't think that's a worthy way for any of us to behave. And I've never said this about the Global Warming Foundation, even though I'm surprised we don't know where the money comes from. I've never done that because our job is to try to look at the facts. And I don't think that ad hominem arguments are acceptable in any circumstances, and we won't use them.
Good. That's very splendid. And I hope you will make that to those who accuse some of us of being motivated by financial incentives which we don't even have. May I continue?
Could I just ask, as you said it specifically to me, Mr. Liddy, could you point to an occasion in which I've done that?
No, I'm not saying you. No.
But then as long as we're absolutely clear.
I was hoping that you would make your splendid statement to those who accuse. Yeah, absolutely. The CMIP5 global climate models give an estimate for warming over the next couple of decades of between 0.48 and 1.15 degrees centigrade. Yet the fifth assessment, the Working Group 1 final draft, reduces that by 40% to a range of by 0.3 and 0.7 degrees centigrade on the basis, I gather, of expert assessment. In other words, the experts think the models are wrong. Now, I'd like your comments on that and ask whether it's consistent, having assumed they're wrong for the next 20 years, that they're running too hot. Why rely on the models for the remainder of the century?
Well, the first principle I have is that one should take the most, if I may dare use the word, the most conservative view about these matters into account, and therefore I think it's absolutely right that if people feel that this may be so, that should be taken into account. There are other areas where evidence suggests that this may be a significant underestimate, and we have seen a whole lot of discussion since then which has led to that view. I think one has to accept that this is the best evidence that we have, that there is quite a lot of evidence that this is actually underestimating what the effect is.
So which is, the models or the experts?
The reduction may be at the conservative end of it, if I'm using it in that sense, but I'm sticking to that, and that seems to me sensible.
The reduction may be at the conservative end.
Well, let's be clear. We have not relied on climate models to come to our conclusions. We've looked at 3 lines of evidence. We've looked at energy balance models. We've looked at the historical record. And we've looked at climate models, those 3. That's what gives you the range of uncertainty for climate sensitivity. And I've said that we've modelled, and it's very clear, if you read the report, it's very clear that we have looked across the range of estimates of climate sensitivity from all 3 lines of evidence. We've not said climate models are superior to energy balance models, for example, or vice versa. We've said we need to look at all of those and consider across the range of uncertainty, across the range of risk, what is the appropriate response.
But I'm merely quoting what the IPCC is doing. They are effectively saying that the models have been running too hot, are expected to continue to run too hot for the next 20 years, but thereafter they'll come right again. Don't you think that, or didn't that undermine your confidence a little in this whole process?
Well, if it were the only thing we're basing ourselves on, it might, but that's not the point. The point is that, as David has said, and I was going on to say, that we've taken different routes to look at this, and we've come to our conclusions not by putting dittos under the IPCC's report, but saying, looking at this and looking at these other things, we have come to this conclusion. That's our job.
I mean, if all we relied on was the climate models, actually the 80% target, you'd have to say it probably is not stringent enough and we should be doing more, if that was all you relied on. But because we don't rely on the climate models, because we look at all of the different lines of evidence, we've said, well, it is okay to keep with the 80% for now, but let's watch very carefully what happens in this area, and that's important as well. We always continue to look at the scientific evidence. We've got the flexibility to respond to that.
How do you make a forecast without a model?
We use models, but you can put the numbers into the models that come from all of the different parts of the literature. So you can say, well, what is the expected temperature increase if we assume, to use the jargon, if we assume a climate sensitivity of 1.5, which is the very low end of the range in the IPCC report. If that was the case, what is the temperature change you would expect to see in 2100 based on assumptions about emissions over time? So that is something you can do. Now, the way that the climate models work, if you don't put that number in at the low end of the range, they tend to use a higher number, so they get a higher temperature increase. We've said, well, let's take the numbers out of the climate models, let's put the lower numbers that people have suggested into a model and see what happens then. And that's what our recommendations are based on.
Good. I just return to the point that my colleague Graham Stringer made earlier, that although I wouldn't expect anything that's happened to remove your confidence, or in my own confidence, that the underlying greenhouse effect will continue, wouldn't you think that the fact there's been a pause, the fact that recent studies have tended to come out with these lower climate sensitivities that you've mentioned, wouldn't that make you think that, on the whole, it was a bit less alarming than previously it had been?
I don't think that is the result of what you've said, and it certainly isn't the result if it's taken in the context of other evidence which has a different view. I think the moderate position which we take is the right one, and that is that there is sufficient evidence to lead us to believe that any sensible, responsible person should seek to ensure that we do not increase the emissions, but indeed reduce them very significantly, as a matter at least of insurance and probably of absolute necessity. That seems to me to be unchanged, and I'm more confident in that today than I was a year ago, and I wish I wasn't.
Sorry, you did earlier ask me whether you had ever cast doubt on the motivation of climate sciences, and I now remember that you did precisely that at the conference that we both spoke at in Cambridge, Fisher House, where you advised everybody to read the book called The Deniers, and they would see the real motivation of these people. Afterwards, Dick Linton came up to me and said he thought that was the most disgraceful remark he'd ever heard.
Well, if that is an exact word of what I said, it is exactly what I believe. The book on the deniers does not talk about the scientists. The book on the deniers talks about the coal industry and other industries who are taking actions which are very parallel to those of the tobacco industry. Largely dealing with the United States, not referring either to the scientists or to people like yourself who take a principled view, and one which you've always taken, because I can remember you telling me off for believing in climate change in the way that I did after a cabinet meeting some 20 years ago. So I know perfectly well that you've always taken that view, and I wouldn't dream of saying it is other than a totally principled view. The book, The Climate Deniers, has very specific evidence of large-scale, largely American businesses spending great sums of money to cast doubt upon the scientists. And if you are concerned about that, there's a very interesting interview with one of the major climate scientists to say exactly what happened to him in those circumstances. But that's not the same as denying the perfectly proper position that you and Lord Lawson and Matt Ridley have got on this issue.
Let's return to the fourth carbon budget. Robert.
Yes, you also were looking at international action in terms of reassessing your recommendations. What exactly did you take into account looking across the international perspective?
Well, you have to try to get, first of all, what people say they're doing, and then you have to look at what is the reality of that, because there is often a distinction between that. So what we tried to do is to see, first of all, what people in other countries, other organisations were doing, and then seeing, or saying they were doing, and then seeing what in effect they were doing, and that led us to make the conclusions that we had there.
So you did conclude that the UK is not acting alone. What's the other countries, would you say, have a comparable ambition to the UK?
I think the phrase comparable ambition is a very helpful one, because that's, I think, the right phrase to compare. I think that China does. I think that countries as surprising as Mexico do. In their own different ways, of course, most of the members of the European Union, but certainly the European Union as a whole. And then, because of the way that things work, significant parts of the United States have got comparable ambitions. The whole of that West Coast alliance, which stretches from California right into Canada with British Columbia, is certainly committed to similar ambitions to ourselves.
On the other hand, Canada as a whole, Australia and Japan are dropping their ambitions.
Indeed, and very sadly. Canada is an interesting case because, as you say, as a whole it's doing that, but yet there are some of the Canadian provinces that are sticking to very strong measures. Indeed, if people asked me what I thought about actual measures, I think the British Columbian carbon tax system is one that's well worth looking at as a mechanism, because it seems to me to have a number of really valuable elements to it, and actually has been supported by both political parties in those circumstances. So you're perfectly right. The picture in Australia is much more gloomy, and of course it is difficult if you have a government that doesn't believe the science in any way.
So how does that not have an implication for the UK if the other countries are taking a backward step, going back, I suppose, to the earlier?
Well, other people in the same time have been doing more. If you look, I don't want to come back to the issue, but if you look at what's happening in some of the countries we've referred to, a great deal more is being done. So, and in the areas where a very high proportion of the emissions are made, a great deal more is being done. So, on balance, we have to say, around the world, it's better than it was, with significant and very sad decisions by the Australian government and the Canadian government. The effect of the Australian government, of course, was to reverse things which were pretty recently imposed by the previous government. And I'm sorry about that, but in the whole, it doesn't alter the fact that many other people are doing what we would expect them to do, and some are doing some more intensive things than we are.
If you think in terms of, has there been a significant change, which is what you would have to identify to change the budget? In 2010, we said there will be a UN process. There have been some Copenhagen Accord commitments, and there is a challenge to deliver against those commitments. Now, our assessment currently is that the UN process has moved forward in the way envisaged. So it was envisaged it would move forward towards a conclusion in 2015. That is still the aim and the expectation. And second, the Copenhagen Accord commitments, whereas those may have looked very stretching at the time, they now look realistic, for example, both for the States and for Canada. So that's a positive change in that respect. We're also clear there is still a big challenge getting global agreement, and getting global agreement that goes beyond 2020. But there isn't any reason there to say, well, we should change the budget because that remains as a challenge.
So is the UK's, how important is the UK's ambition to securing global agreement?
Well, first of all, the United Kingdom has put itself into a position over the years of leadership in this, notably at Kyoto, when John Prescott certainly did that, notably in the European Union as a whole. So the first thing is, I think the European Union's position on this is crucial to provide that agreement, and our role in the European Union is vital to that. Secondly, we are a country which has used a specific mechanism, the Climate Change Act, to give ourselves a proper, paced procedure to reach an end. And that has been increasingly influential throughout the rest of the world. People doing it in their own way, but seeing this as their model. And as I go around the world and people come here, one of the things that they always say to me is that the United Kingdom has set a fine example. So we are very important, and keeping to the way in which we are proceeding is very important in the way that the rest of the world, whether it's in South Africa or Mexico, or whether it's among what I call more progressive views in the United States and Canada.
So in 2015, would there be a tipping point if the pessimistic scenario comes out and the international agreement doesn't push forward? Would there be a tipping point at which point the UK has to say we're going it alone too much?
Hypothetical situations are not ones which I really want to respond to, but it seems to me that you could have a situation, of course you could have a situation in which nobody's doing anything anywhere, and the whole thing is, then you've got to ask yourself, what do you do as a nation faced with calamity on the one hand and the rest of the world refusing to take seriously on the other hand? I don't think we're going to get to there, so I don't think it's an answer that I want to make.
I mean, we will look again in 2015. We have to look again anyway when we give the government and parliament advice on the fifth carbon budget. What we've shown in the fourth carbon budget actually is that it is robust to a whole range of outcomes at the international level. So it doesn't rely on there being the most ambitious international agreement signed up to in 2015. If there was something less ambitious, well, the fourth carbon budget would still make sense. Now, there is a boundary beyond which you may look at lowering the ambition, but we will come back and we will look again at that time.
Yeah, well, Deben, you were quoted as saying that Britain must press on with fracking. Well, I understand your comments about security. Where does that actually fit in with the emissions and our targets for future years?
Well, if you look at our the way in which we have constructed the most cost-effective route to 2050, that does require or expect a use of gas. Not at the end of the scale, but as an interim use. It seems to us, or it seems to me, that if we were able to produce that gas from our own resources, there are significant advantages to that. Because you don't increase the emissions if you're going to use some gas. This is better to use your own gas. That's the first thing. Secondly, fracking, of course, is not just a question of the production of gas for energy purposes. Fracking may well be able to, we don't know yet because we haven't done it sufficiently to know what the composition of the gas is in each place, but fracking could easily produce the fractions which are necessary for using gas as a feedstock. Now, if that were so, then you wouldn't be talking about the same thing at all. You'd be talking about a very valuable resource being used in the best possible way. I think most of us would prefer fossil fuels, which are of their nature finite, to be used in the best way, and as a feedstock that would be very valuable. So my view is that we should proceed to see what fracking can take place, what it produces. It can play a proper part. There are three things perhaps to be careful about. One is not to invest in an infrastructure which means that you do find yourself in the circumstances in which you have to use gas when there were better alternatives because you spent so much money on the infrastructure. That's an issue you've got to take seriously. And then the other two issues to take seriously, I think, are either end of the spectrum. I mean, I think that those who have a kind of theological objection to fracking at the one end of the green movement are just wrong, factually wrong. I don't see the argument. You do have to have proper environmental controls, but that's a different issue. I also think those at the other end who suggest that this is a sort of wonderful save-all for everybody really haven't looked either at the scientific facts and the likelihoods, or indeed of the real difficulties and the differences between this country and the United States. So somewhere in the middle, it seems to me, is the right position for us to be, and as far as I can see it, this is what the government is.
If we invest into fracking, people will want a return on their money, that's for sure. But yet, I know from being at climate change conferences, they've all stated that by the time we get to 2030, we have to wind down our gas so as we can meet targets for 2050. Is that not right? Well, I see Dr. Kennedy shaking his head there.
There will still be very significant gas consumption in this country in 2030 in a world where we are carbon
that's not what I'm
constant.
saying. I'm saying you would reach a level, but from that point on you have to wind down.
Well, you wind it down, but the gas demand in 2030 we would expect to be much more than any shale gas coming to the market in this country, and that would continue to be the case. So there isn't an inconsistency that says, you know, if we have shale gas, it will dwarf gas demand. It's the other way around. Gas demand will dwarf the shale gas probably coming to the market.
And as I'm sure you'd agree, Mr. Robson, if we were in that position, we would be much more likely to want to scale down the imported gas, particularly that which comes from regimes where perhaps we'd be happier not to be dependent.
Peter.
At our last meeting, can I return to the issues raised by Sir Robert about whether the failure of others to curb their emissions makes our own efforts almost nugatory. When we last met at this committee, I took issue with you when you said the Chinese government has tightened its 5-year plan, its policies to reduce emissions very significantly, and I said it wasn't planning to reduce emissions, it was actually planning to reduce the intensity of its emissions, and you said that that was the position, but it's changed, and over the last 3 months there's subsequent evidence of that. Now, since we've had some correspondence and you've set the record straight, I wonder whether you'd like to say straight in public.
Well, the letter is very clear. I think when one reads exactly what I said, it is consonant with what our letter says. I said in the letter, because I mean it, I'm sorry if my comments resulted in a misunderstanding. I think you read the comments. Clearly, some people have read it in a different way from that which is intended, or indeed which I think it means. But I don't want to mislead anybody, so I've just said I'm sorry that people have interpreted it in a different way. I stand by what I said, and I think the letter makes that very clear.
Oh, you stand by what you said? That it is the policy... Oh, I misread
well, I'm sorry,
your letter.
I'm just quoting... When I say so, I'm quoting the letter and the response and the quotes which were in the letter that you sent, or
well, I'm
Mr.
quoting
Yeo sent.
the text of our discussion, and you said the Chinese government has now tightened its 5-year plan.
Well,
its policy is to reduce emissions very significantly.
Well,
and it hasn't, and it isn't.
Well, first of all, it has tightened its 5-year plan.
Oh, when? Well, we asked for evidence
it
of this,
has
and you
announced,
failed to provide it.
I have said exactly what I believe to be so in the letter. Let me just refer for the point of the... I've explained exactly, because we're in very close contact with those who are dealing with these matters in China, and I have to try to give the committee, as far as I possibly can, my estimate as what is happening in China. I've got no interest, so to speak, but I'm just trying to give you the best knowledge that I can. And all that I can say is that within the Chinese government at the moment, the discussion that is going on is not about carbon intensity issues. The discussion is about when peaking will happen. That's what the discussion is about. They will make their political decision as when they make that decision as to what the date will be and when they actually say it. But the best information I can give this committee is what I've given it, and I stick by that, and I think that's all I'm going to say.
So you agree or disagree with the statement? What originally raised it was I mentioned that the committee itself, this committee, had produced a report which said that half the growth in carbon emissions between now and 2030 would come from China. And that I found it difficult to square that with the idea that they were taking stringent measures to reduce their emissions significantly.
Well, as you know, the emissions from China have been increasing sharply. Much of it because of the fact that they are manufacturing for the rest of the world, and they have committed themselves some time ago, which the committee referred to reduce their carbon intensity but not their total emissions. I was trying to explain to the committee that our evidence from China is that the government understands that peaking is certainly possible and obtainable. They are discussing as to when that might be. They have not announced a date or indeed an intention. But my job is to try to tell you all that I know, and all that I know is that that's what the discussion is about, and it isn't about not doing this, it is about doing this. And therefore, that is an evidence, that is something that has happened since the committee made its excellent report, and that's all I was trying to do, and put that in the context, and we shall see whether a change takes place, and we shall see whether they go further than I have suggested or less far, but I can only give you the evidence that I've got.
Moving on from that rather unsatisfactory exchange, in your document on the fourth thing, you say, our analysis suggests that UK targets imply reductions in carbon intensity to 2020 comparable to other countries, including China. So we are being as rigorous as China rather than them doing something very dramatic, it would appear.
In a particular period of time, that is correct. But I can hold that perfectly rationally by saying that at the same time, what they are intending to do appears to be significantly greater in a very much more difficult circumstance, which of course is true in a country which is developing in the way that China is.
Though the report also says, your report also says, that per capita emissions in China are now comparable with the UK and EU average. So they're comparable now. They're going to increase substantially and account for half the increase in emissions worldwide. And yet so they're going to use a lot more per capita than us. And yet we're taking as stringent action as them to reduce our emissions.
Well, I really do think one has to take seriously the difference in the situation. Here is a country which is making its development and paying for its huge social problems largely by doing there what we don't do here any longer. That's what they are doing. And therefore, a very large number of their emissions are the result of what we in the West are demanding. Well, that's part of life. So here is a country trying to come to terms with this. And I am merely saying to you, Mr. Lilly, that this is a country which has not caused climate change up to now. We have, in this part of the world. We have a responsibility, past responsibility, a moral responsibility of some importance. That is not theirs. They have not done that. Our job is to create a world in which it's possible for them to develop without endangering the planet. So what I'm looking at is what is this country, which is on a trajectory like this, what is it doing? Well, first of all, it says we are going to reduce the carbon intensity. This is very parallel with what major companies have done. They've said, first of all, we will reduce the carbon intensity of our production. That's the first thing they say. And then they're pressed to say that still means that if you're going to produce more bottles or more packages, then you're going to increase the amount of carbon you use. And they say gradually, well, we've really got to come to a situation in which we don't increase the amount of carbon, even though we're increasing our business. Now, that's what China is talking about now in a very serious and specific way in the government as to how they move from the present situation, which you perfectly rightly identify, and which they have been, and I agree with you, not only for climate change reasons, but for pollution reasons, which they have been tightening on a regular basis, how they move from that to a point at which they peak. The information that is important is that peaking is possible within the 2020s, that they are discussing where that might be, and it is likely that they will make political decisions on that basis, but they will be as political as anyone else as to when they announce it.
One final point, if I may, from your very helpful report. You said they're now thinking of planning to reduce their carbon intensity, indeed, by 40 to 45% by 2020 compared to the 2005 levels. You also say that since 1990, Chinese emissions have grown by 290% and GDP by 699%. That implies that they reduced intensity by 58% over 20 years, i.e. at roughly the same rate as they're intending to continue reducing intensity over the next 15 years. So there's nothing much new there, is there?
Well, I'd have to look at that rather carefully before I answer.
It's your report.
No, the particular way in which you've looked at it, I'll look at it very carefully and write to you.
Thank you.
Dan.
Thank you, Chair. Following up on the discussion we had earlier about your review of international action, can I particularly focus on EU developments? And could you just tell us how your review of EU developments in particular influenced your recommendations on the level of the fourth carbon budget?
Well, there are two elements to this. One is what is actually happening and what people are doing in Germany and various countries. And the other is the process by which the EU is coming together in order to make its decisions for the future. In the first one, obviously there are some very encouraging decisions being made in a number of countries. Germany, Denmark, the two you pick out particularly, where those things are happening. Very interesting effects in Spain, for example, after a rather difficult stage on their renewables, seems to be moving into the right position now. So we would take all that into account. Then there's the EU itself. And that's more difficult because we've got the present situation and we're in the middle of deciding what the next situation will be. So what we did there was to say, let's put a whole series of scenarios down. Let's imagine the very least ambitious. How would that be consonant with the fourth carbon budget? And that's why we were able to come to say that if the EU does the very least that is sensibly likely, the fourth carbon budget would still be the position that one would want to be. It also made us come to the view that if the EU accepted the government's proposition, that's when we would really seriously have to look at tightening the budget, because that is the effect of taking that view. Of course, you can't prognosticate. Life is such that it's very often true that you don't get the most ambitious answer.
Did you consider a more ambitious fourth carbon budget in light of the UK government's public position on a tighter 2030 EU?
We considered what would be the effect, but we thought that it was wrong to try to do now what you couldn't do with certainty until you got to that certainty. And as that certainty may be as much as 3 years' time, given the speed with which these organisations move. I mean, obviously one hopes that it won't be, and it's more likely to be a bit earlier than that because of the 2015 date and because of the French very considerable concern to make that work. So obviously one expects that. But we thought it was better to say clearly that we would have to monitor that, and if that were to arise, then we would have to advise the government on that matter.
Is that something you would do any parallel work on? I mean, if you recognise there's a real possibility that could happen, might you start doing work now on what that might mean in terms of a tighter budget?
Well, we have done.
Or would you have to wait until?
Well, no, we have done some work on it. I think we've done as much as one could do in advance, but we had to do that because we had to be able to say what would be the circumstances, what would be the effect. We've done that work.
Okay.
We'll continue to. We tend to keep this sort of thing in a care and maintenance, if you know what I mean. We care to do the work as it goes on. But I don't envisage doing any more work on that particular figure unless it became clear that we were winning. And there is some indication that there are people who are really trying to get towards that aim.
We've identified the range, as John says. Now, we will come back in July with our Parliament report and say, well, has anything happened in the meantime? And there are two things that will happen. There will be a white paper that will come from Brussels, and there will be a Heads of State meeting in March where this will be discussed. So we'll take stock of those events. But we've said in our advice on the fourth carbon budget, we will have to come back anyway and look at this in a deeper sense in 2015 when we advise on the fifth carbon budget under the Climate Change Act. And this will be one of the central issues, not the only one, but an important one.
But out of interest, do you see yourself as having a role in effect, advising the government on the implications for the UK's carbon budgets of their policy of supporting a tighter 2030 target? Do you see what I mean? Because it's easy for a minister to say we should support a stronger 2030 target, but they need to understand what the implications will be for domestic policy. So do you actually consider that to be part of your role? That sort of speculative advice, as it were?
We would certainly consider that to be part of our role. It would not be part of our role to advise the government as to what its proposition should be. No. It would be part of our role to say, if you propose this, this is the effect on the United Kingdom.
And have you done that? Would you say you've done that?
That's in the report. So, for example, the budget is 1,950 megatons of CO2 equivalent for 2023 to 27. If the government were to be successful in getting its negotiating position, you would tighten that to something like 1,800. From 1950 to 1800. So,
but in terms of what that then means in further detail, that wouldn't
well, how could you achieve that?
Yeah, that's
we
you probably wouldn't do that unless it was happening.
No, I think that's right. Yes.
Okay.
Unless the government said, "Look, we'd rather like to know that." I mean, then of course one is in a has that role
But they haven't
played?
asked you that.
They haven't asked us specifically.
Okay.
No.
If we were to ever suggest a tightening of the budget in response to an outcome in the EU, we would have to say, and this is how you should meet that more ambitious budget, either through doing more in this area, that area, or buying credits in the global carbon market.
So, and then that would be entirely advisory. I mean, to come back to Dr. Whitehead's point, that would be entirely advisory. You would say these are the areas which seem to us to be the most likely areas of being able to get that at the time.
Okay, so if you can allow me just to speculate a little, imagine that the UK is successful in a shorter time frame than you're sort of pessimistic 3 years. What would be the mechanism and the sort of time frame for you responding to that?
Well,
in terms of reviewing, actually genuinely changing or tightening the fourth carbon budget.
Well, the mechanism would be that we would have to interpolate that into so that it took precedence over any other work that we were doing, because it was necessary for the government to know that, and we would do it as rapidly as we could. And given the parameters and the knowledge that we have, that would not take a very long time, because you would be merely applying different figures to information that you already had. So I don't see that as
changing parameters of models rather than building new models.
Yeah. I mean, the government could come and say that this has been agreed. Should we now change the budget? That's one thing. If we advise on the fifth carbon budget, and Europe has agreed a very ambitious target, and we suggest the fifth carbon budget compatible with that target, it would be odd if we didn't also say, well, should we now adjust the fourth carbon budget to be giving us a coherent pathway through to 2030? So there are two mechanisms for that kind of change.
Okay. And I know you said it could be done relatively quickly. Can I press you to be more precise on what that might mean, or would you hesitate to be more precise?
Well, I'm only hesitating because it depends on what circumstances it were done and where we were on it. I mean, imagine
months. Are we talking? Yeah,
months. I mean, but not many months. I mean, I think.
Okay.
I don't think that would be.
Rod? You mentioned that Germany was performing well. I thought there was a sort of view in the street that Germany had sort of slipped.
Well, again, you can both be performing well, and you can be said by some to have slipped from doing the things that they thought that they were going to do. I think that one does have to say overall that they are performing well. I mean, they have a particular problem, which is that they have so far achieved their use of renewables that it's outpaced other decisions in the system. So they have this odd situation in which they have renewables which are currently producing about 30% of their, I speak from memory, but 30% of their energy, and at a peak point 60% of it. But of course the renewables tend to be able to provide the energy at the peak point, which is the lunchtime as far as they are concerned. That causes real difficulties about the base load in terms of the cost of the base load, which are increased by the fact that there were some what would now be thought perhaps wrong decisions made by the major generators to renew their coal-fired power stations, where there's a mismatch between that and their gas ones now, so there is a lot of problem there. So what the government is having to look at is exactly how it sorts that out. It's another of the transition period things. The transition period starts by how do you get enough renewables on the grid, how do you make this work, and then the next bit comes when you have made it work and you want to move to the next stage, which you move from 30% perhaps to 50%, how do you then deal with the base load and how do you operate that? And that's what they're doing at the moment, and this is a slightly 2 steps forward, 1 step back situation, and of course it's made complicated, as sometimes these things are, by the coalition politics of Angela Merkel. Not that I think it would have been very different if she had other coalition politics.
Thanks.
Ian?
Yep. Very early on in the discussions today, Dr. Kennedy, you mentioned the cost effectiveness of the pathway very briefly. How did your review of the cost effectiveness of the pathway influence the recommendation on the level of the fourth carbon target?
It was central to our assessment. So I've said that the fourth carbon budget is designed to pick up the relevant part of the cost-effective pathway to the 2050 target. So we've said, well, has anything changed with the cost-effective pathway? And we've said, well, if anything, the cost-effective pathway now entails lower emissions than it did, which might point you towards tightening the budget. But we've said it's premature to do that given the various uncertainties, particularly over the European context. So we should hold off on that, at least for the time being.
It was central.
Sorry?
It was central.
Absolutely. I mean, and the key message coming out of this is, well, you can either be on the cost-effective pathway to building a low-carbon energy system and economy, or you can delay that. And we said, well, what if you did delay that for 10 years, if you didn't do anything beyond 2020, and then you tried to pick up the pace in the 2030s and the 2040s? And that led us to conclude that under central estimates, so with no assumption that the gas price increases, for example, you would save £100 billion by being on that early action pathway. If you delay, it will cost you £100 billion and more if the gas price were to increase. So there is a significant benefit in being on the cost-effective pathway.
And when updating the assessment towards 2050, what new evidence did you look at?
Well, we look at all of the elements that go in there. So when you're looking at the cost-effective pathway, you say, what are the technology cost estimates, for example, of electric vehicles, heat pumps, solid walls, offshore wind generation, the whole set of low-carbon technologies. You say, what are the costs of the counterfactual, so using conventional technologies, fossil fuel technologies, and they depend in part on fossil fuel price projections, and they depend on carbon price projections. So we looked at the latest assessment of all of those things: technology costs, fossil fuel prices, carbon price projections, and also then the energy demand projections also are an important part of that.
And does decarbonisation of the power sector play a major role in ensuring that the pathway is cost effective?
Certainly. So the decarbonisation of the power sector is central to economy-wide decarbonisation. It is a sensible thing to aim to do earlier rather than later. And again, we did a report last May which looked at the benefits of investment in a portfolio of low-carbon power generation technologies, so renewables, carbon capture and storage, and nuclear. And again, it says, well, if you invest in that portfolio beyond 2020, then there are significant benefits compared to giving up in 2020, having spent a load of money over the next 5 years or so, giving up, having a dash for gas, and then trying to pick up the pace again in the 2030s. That is not an economically sensible way to proceed. So the cost-effective pathway at the economy level embodies early power sector decarbonisation, yeah.
I'm sure, Mr. Larry, perhaps we'll go back to the original methodology, which is that the Climate Change Act enshrined the fact that we committed ourselves to an 80% reduction in emissions by 2050. Our responsibility is to say, well, if you're going to do that, what is the most cost-effective way of getting there? So at all stages, it's central to doing the first, second, third, fourth, fifth carbon budget. So obviously, that's what we have to do. And if you review it, then you, of course, review it in exactly that way. You look and see whether it still remains the most cost-effective way, and was there a better one? And in order to do that, we took the very serious and perfectly reasonable thing to say, well, and most human beings like to say, that is, what if we put it off? If we didn't do it now, we did it later, left it for someone else to do it, would that be sensible? And that's why we came to the conclusion, I've got those figures as to what the extra cost would be for doing that.
Dan.
Thank you very much. Can I just very quickly ask you a question? It is related, but slightly at a tangent. You've calculated a £20 cost per household of the levy control framework. I think is that between 2020 and 2030. Is that right?
Yeah. So it's the additional.
Yeah. Can you confirm that you've changed the benchmark for how you're calculating the cost of the levy control framework post 2020 for how you calculated it before 2020? Is that right?
Yeah. Well, what we've said is, I mean, the levy control framework should measure subsidy for technology developments. It's subsidy that's there for a good reason, but what you want to measure is subsidy. Now, the way that the power system works and the wholesale market works is the more low-carbon technologies you have on the system, then the wholesale price is not a relevant benchmark for comparing how much subsidy do we need to give over and above that wholesale price. So as you invest in low-carbon technologies, because of the nature of those technologies, they have low short-run marginal costs. You depress wholesale prices in the market. That would tell you that actually you are giving massive subsidies for low-carbon technologies, which isn't the case. So instead we've said, well, what you should do is compare the cost of the low-carbon technologies with the cost of the alternative that you would invest in, which is gas-fired generation. And if you do that, then the low-carbon technology additional costs become very small. It's the only sensible way to think about a levy control framework in the 2020s.
So the 2020s, as a benchmark, you use the cost of a new CCGT.
Yeah.
And
which are the two things you're comparing? They are the two alternatives.
And do you strip out the cost of the carbon floor price, or do you include the cost of the carbon floor price in the CCGT cost, if you see what I mean, the carbon price?
We include the cost of the carbon floor price there. So the carbon price will go up, which will push up the cost of CCGT over time. Then there is a £20 over and above that, which is the low carbon technology.
So by doing that, you're assuming the carbon floor price, in effect, is not one of the measurements that we're trying to measure the additional cost of on consumers.
We factor that in as a baseline cost of gas generation. Whether it's the carbon floor price or whether you assume it's the EU ETS price that has risen to a similar level by that time, but it's the cost over and above that.
Out of interest, do you do any work on the cost in which you don't include those as given costs? Because it does seem that if the goal here is to establish the additional cost of climate change policy, actually EU ETS and carbon floor price are both part of climate change policy.
Yeah, we thought about, do you make a distinction there in the sense when you're reviewing the fourth carbon budget, you're not reviewing, for example, the UK's commitment to the EU emissions trading scheme and the carbon price that will differentiate. So we wanted to isolate the incremental impact. But if you look in the report, we do say there's a figure which I can't recall off the top of my head. There is a figure which is the incremental impact on consumers of the rising carbon price through the 2020s. So that is there. Okay. But as I say, the incremental, what is the delta associated with the fourth carbon budget? Assuming that we are still part of the EU ETS, what is the delta? That's the £20, and that's relative to the alternative investment in gas-fired generation.
Thank you. What we do have to do is, and thank you for asking questions, Mark. But I mean, what we try to do is to make the distinctions which are necessary in what is a very complex matter. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I think bedevils the argument is that people tend to take a selection of these things and say that's what it is, and then someone else will take a different selection. So what we've tried to do is to give you the opportunity of being able to see that. Now the £20 is a useful figure because it makes a useful statement about what happens if you do X rather than do Y. But it isn't a complete answer, which is why we've put the rest of it in there.
Yeah, I just wanted to clear that up because it's not always clear, as you said, what each figure is actually referring to. Is it?
Well,
things do get quoted.
I have to look it up again each time.
You're right, and it's important. There is a figure quoted for the decarbonisation target in 2030 of £125. That is compared to a wholesale price which is close to nothing. And which is a kind of nonsense calculation, really. And again, if you use the relevant and sensible calculation compared to a CCGT, then you get the £20 figure.
Thanks very much.
Okay, well, we've covered a useful amount of ground. Thank you very much for coming in, and I'm sure we shall continue to discuss these issues with you in the course of this year.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you.
Portcullis House, the Wilson Room.